Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to this session of the Dialogues in European Jain Studies Connecting Around the Globe series. I am joined by my colleagues Tine Vekemans from the University of Ghent and Chris Miller for the Arihanta Institute. So as you know, we have collaborated to develop this speaker series to support and advance the dialogue between the contributors of the latest research in Jain studies. And we are really pleased that you came this evening or this morning or this afternoon, wherever, depending on where you are, for this event on Jainism and animals. So today, as you can see, we have a great lineup of speakers. Before I hand it over to my colleague Chris, who is going to introduce them, one housekeeping remark. So there is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You can put your questions for the speakers here during the presentations. And we will read your questions during the Q&A bits after the talks. Okay, so I think everything is clear now, and now I will be giving the floor to Chris to introduce the speakers of this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie-Elaine. And it gives me great pleasure today to introduce three wonderful colleagues of mine, our presider and our two presenters in this topic on Jainism and animals. So we have our presider coming from Ghent University, Professor Tine Vekemans, holds the Ācārya Mahāprajña Chair for Jain Studies at Ghent University. Additionally, she is a postdoctoral research fellow funded by the university's Special Research Fund. Her approach to Jain studies combines ethnography with textual studies, but always starts from practices and experiences of Jains. Over the past decade, her research touched upon diverse aspects of modern Jainism, including Jain migration history, changing lay-mendicant relations, Jainism in the digital age, and processes of knowledge transfer in the Jain diaspora. Her recent book, Digital and Diaspora, Intertwined Frontiers of Jainism, won the 2023 Bhagwan Kunthunatha Annual Best Book Award, and I have to highly recommend that book. I have it here on my bookshelf right next to me, actually.
Let me, without further ado, then introduce the other speakers. So our first speaker after my introduction will be Jonathan Dickstein, who is Assistant Professor of Jain Studies and Vegan Studies at Arihanta Institute, Visiting Assistant Professor at Claremont School of Theology. He specializes in South Asian religions, religion and animals, good for today, religion and ecology, and comparative ethics, and has received his doctoral degree in religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara. His dissertation was on ancient Indian animal taxonomies and their relevance to ritual performance, dietary practice, and social stratification. Currently, he focuses on Jainism and contemporary social justice issues, extending into environmental studies, critical animal studies, food studies, and diaspora studies. He's published in Philosophy East and West, Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, Food Ethics, and religions on topics such as yoga and diet, Jain veganism, Jain environmental ethics, and veganism and leftist politics. And considers himself a scholar practitioner, having spent many years not only in libraries, but also in public advocating for both human and non-human justice. He will present a paper titled An American Pajrapol. And then after his contribution, we continue with our second presenter, Joey Taminello, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at McNeese State University in Lake Charles, LA, USA, and a program coordinator for the nonprofit organizations Farm Forward and Better Food Foundation, so another scholar practitioner then. His research focuses on the intersection of animal, environmental, and food philosophies through the lenses of hermeneutics, pragmatism, and Jainism. His talk is titled Jainism and Faux Meat, Social and Philosophical Approaches. And these talks, I will already kind of say, fit together in a beautiful, beautiful dialogue. So I'm really glad to see that many of you could join us. I think it will be an exhilarating morning, evening, afternoon, midnight, depending on where you are. Okay, so Chris has not unfrozen. Then I will give the floor to myself to ease you guys into the topic. Let's see. All right. Do we see slides? Marjolein, give me a quick yes. Yes. Okay, perfect. So I was thinking of how to introduce this topic because there's a lot of ways in which you could start a conversation. Jainism is a really rich tradition, and we all know that there is a lot of animals in narrative literature. They play an important role, so that's one place to start. I could start from the most ancient layers of history. That would be a place to start. But I thought, why don't I start with a question which around the dinner table with my Belgian family would be rather controversial in its own right, being how do we consider ourselves in relation to non-human animals? I could already see my aunts and my grandma kind of being slightly resentful at the use of the term non-human animal because it implies that we are a human animal. But what lies at the heart of this resentment? How do we consider ourselves in relation to animals? If we were to analyze any of our answers, including my aunts and my nans, to that question, we would, I'm sure, find a balance of, you could say, exceptionalism and egalitarianism. Most systems of thought the world over will recognize human and non-human animals share the trait of being living sentient beings. However, they do attribute an exceptional place to humans, most of them do, who as a species are considered to have superior abilities, ratio, different rights, but maybe also duties which non-human animals have not. In traditions which recognize human-animal and animal-human rebirth, there's usually still some exceptionalism to be found. Even in Jainism, which we focus on today, a human birth is considered necessary to develop the right frame of mind to pursue spiritual purification, which is needed to eventually attain moksha. However, human and non-human lives present in such traditions as much more interlinked, continuations of the same soul through different phases, which is most condensedly expressed in the much heard aphorism parasparograho jivanam. Combined with Jainism's strong emphasis on non-violence in thought, word, and deed, this more interlinked view of human and non-human existence has led to ethical and practical considerations which have been identified as typically Jain, and which have prompted South Asian as well as Western authors to marvel in wonder, to rethink their own ideas, and to be inspired to apply these ethical considerations derived from Jain philosophy to contemporary issues well beyond the traditional Indian context. Our two wonderful speakers today will each approach Jainism and animals in a way which is closest to that last perspective, an application of Jain principles to contemporary issues in a non-Indian contemporary context. As an intro, though, I do want to illustrate the wonder that is often present when people learn about Jainism and animals and the way that they relate. And I want to ease you guys into the topic by telling you a little bit based on my own research of how diasporic and online Jainism really shows that this topic, human and non-human animal relations, forms one of the more important discursive spaces where Jain and other ideas tend to mingle and meet, forging activist alliances, inspiring individuals, but also ending up in discussions where people agree to disagree. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is actually what I wanted to start from. This is a 15th century account of the travels of Vasco da Gama from Decadas da Asia by Portuguese historians João de Barros. So Vasco da Gama lands in Malindi on the East African coast in 1498, and we read that he received the visit of some Moors from the kingdom of Cambay, who were passing through Malindi on board of their ships. Among them were some of the men called Banyans, who are gentlemen of this kingdom of Cambay. Men so religious that they do not even kill the vermin that they have on their own bodies, nor do they eat any living thing. I borrow here from a translation published as part of a Kenyan journey by recently deceased Kenyan lawyer Feroz Navroji, who sort of draws the conclusion that this is about the Shahs, so that this is about the Jain community. It's not overtly stated in the original. But you can find similar observations, often also referring to Gujarat, in many of the English and the German and the other Western travel accounts, both pre-colonial and from colonial times. Their ethical treatment of animals, both in the form of incidental care, like not killing vermin, which happens to land on their bodies, but also organized animal care in the form of goshalas and pajrapols, as well as their plant-based diets, induced a sense of wonder, and it marked people as Jains. It's hard to deduce in these old Western sources whether they speak from a point of admiration or rather sheer bewilderment, coming from a context where the diet of those who could afford it uncontroversially included meat and fish. Right. But then, based on my own research, it's clear that animal care, perhaps most often in its guise as diet and food-related practices, has remained an important way in which Jainism is profiled and also presents itself to non-Jain others. It's perhaps one of the easiest ways in, the easiest topics to start discussing Jainism in many contexts. When I looked at a network of Jain websites, which is what I did for my PhD, I looked at Jain websites and then also the websites they refer to in tier 2, that's called. So these websites that they refer to aren't necessarily Jain, they can include other websites. It was amply clear that, one, vegetarianism, veganism, and animal care are part and parcel of the online world of digital Jainism. And two, that one of the most common type of website that Jain websites would refer to were organizations like PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, so big animal welfare organization, and vegan organizations, vegetarian recipe listings, all kinds of these things, which indicates a common cause. During fieldwork then, when I took part in Pachala classes, board meetings, food fairs, pujas, and every other Jain activities under the sun, and interviewed Jains of different backgrounds in different diasporic locations, the ethics of care and diet pertaining to animals often featured prominently without me actually having to ask. Jain students in Michigan shared their Jainified McDonald's order with me. Jain entrepreneurs in London proudly spoke about their Jain vegan catering service. Chai was served on many occasions, sometimes explicitly with oat milk, sometimes not. The prominence of the topic, both within Jain organization and in shared discursive places, is striking. However, this does not mean that all Jains are of one mind on these issues. And this is important to keep in mind. One example, when it comes to diet, the gradual adoption of veganism in part of the Jain community is, at times, a contentious issue. Research shows that there's a progression towards adoption of a vegan diet in parts of the diaspora, which is also confirmed by my website research, which saw a rather significant rise in the percentage of overtly vegan websites in the corpus, going from 50% in 2013 to over 70% in 2017. However, the progression is uneven, and quite a few traditionalists, if we can use that word, do not much care for the shift. Questioning, for example, what with the Jains adopting a non-dairy diet, which does include root vegetables. Another example, and this is a quote which relates to that, pertains to animal care and Jivdaya donations collected by Jain organizations for charity work. Discussions on the most appropriate recipients for those funds are ancient and could be a really interesting topic for a session in itself. However, specifically related to those who are actually in favor of donating to animal welfare institutions, there is a lot of discussion that I was privileged enough to witness during field work. Some prefer traditional goshalas in India. Others vehemently argue against these, stating different reasons, such as absolute non-kill policies, limited veterinary care, and a refusal to provide appropriate food for compulsory carnivorous animals as reasons to find this questionable. Whereas many Jain organizations did hyperlink to the PETA website, to the PETA website, activist methods are at times scrutinized from a Jain ethical perspective. PETA has been known for employing provocative and confrontational tactics, graphic public campaigns, and aggressive protests in a way to draw attention to animal rights issues. Jains committed to non-violence in all aspects at times find this shock value at an angle with their own ethical framework. Both aim to protect animals, but the means by which they pursue this goal can differ significantly. So although it is clear that animals are key to Jainism and the way that Jain tradition interacts with other modes of thinking, such disagreements and nuances show how dynamic and diverse the field of Jain applied ethics relating to animals is. Voices advocating different degrees of active and passive ahimsa, those striving to stick to traditional practices, or at the other end, reapply Jain ethics, integrating modern and recent scientific finding in new contexts, kind of, take up different spaces in this discursive field. The two talks that will now follow will further interact with these tensions, active, passive ahimsa, traditional practices, or indeed reapplications and rethinkings of Jain ethics. Jonathan Dickstein will discuss animal sanctuaries in Jainism, starting from his experiences with Love in Arms Animal Sanctuary, whose website was indeed also in my research. And then Joey Tominello will speak next and will examine what Jain ethics may have to say about faux meat substitutes. Interestingly, I found that both explore the ethical implications of challenging the system from within, of branding your plant-based protein as meat or presenting your sanctuary as a farm. I'm sure this dialogue will get many of us thinking about Jainism, food, human and non-human animals, maybe even their aunts and their grandmas, legitimate approaches to activism, and the implications of what we think, speak, and do. I invite you all, by the way, and this is the slide to remind me to do this, to type your questions to me, to Jonathan, or to Joey in the Q&A box. We will get to them all the way at the end of our 3 presentations. And I will now gladly give the floor to Jonathan to start his talk.
Thank you so much, Tine, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Marie-Hélène and Chris, also Joey, for joining me on this panel. This is such a wonderful series. I've been enjoying the dialogue series for so long now. I'm super happy and honored to be a part of it. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And that's visible. We're all good. So an American Punjabi tradition and innovation at Love in Arms Animal Sanctuary. Felix doesn't remember me, but it's my own fault. I first met Felix at his home in Lafayette, Colorado in the spring of 2016. 4 months later, I moved hundreds of miles away to pursue my doctorate. I visit him whenever I travel to Colorado, but that's rarely more than once a year. And sadly, I sense that our time is running out. Felix is 9, and that is quite old for a pig who is bred for size and destined for slaughter shortly after his first birthday. His brother Franklin, who would be the same age, died about 7 years ago. A non-industrialized pig might live between 15 and 20 years, but it is impossible to imagine Felix surviving, not to mention thriving, that long. But my regrets and forebodings aside, I fondly recall my last visit, a frigid morning in January 2024, when I got to see and feel this massive black and white spotted softie. He doesn't remember me, but I consider him my friend and always will. Felix's forever home is Love and Arms Animal Sanctuary, a Jain-founded refuge currently occupying 40 acres in Erie, Colorado. It's easy to find. Get to Denver, head north on I-25 to Weld County Road 8, and turn right on Colorado Road 7. The drive takes about 30 minutes. The sanctuary, which arguably presents more farm-like than the small dairy next door, which is its own topic to discuss, is hard to miss. To my knowledge, Love and Arms is the only Jain-founded Panjrapol in North America and perhaps anywhere outside of India. Panjrapol, and alternatively Pindrapol, is the English language rendering of the Gujarati word Pinjrapol, and also the Marathi Panjrapola. The Gujarati term derives from the Sanskrit word Panjara, meaning a cage or enclosure. The remainder of the term's etymology is a bit unclear. And in addition, literature on the ancient history of Pandrapols is somewhat thin. Virtually all secondary sources in English direct readers to Derek Lodrick's invaluable Sacred Cows and Sacred Places, and if at all to a few other secondary sources, such as those by Brett Evans, who did research as an undergrad on the topic. Some locate the origin of Indian animal sanctuaries in the cultural milieu of Ashoka, or select prohibitions against animal killing and abandonment in the Arthashastra and Manavadharma Shastra, or the emergence of non-Jain cow-specific sheds or enclosures. But many of these claims are speculative. As Tine mentioned, there is evidence from European travel accounts from the mid-2nd millennium that Jain Pandrapols had been in existence for some time. For example, Lodrick cites English merchant Ralph Fitch, who wrote upon visiting Cambay, which is in present-day Gujarat, in 1591. In Cambay, they will kill nothing nor have anything killed. In the town, they have hospitals to keep lame dogs and cats, and for birds, they will give meat to the ants. Yet, can we get more precise regarding how long Jain Pandrapols have been in existence? What is the situation, numerically or politically, today? In the not too far future, I intend to help address this archival lacuna. My talk today juxtaposes this sanctuary, Love and Arms Animal Sanctuary, with the phenomenon of a diaspora-heavy, engaged Jainism. Christopher Miller describes engaged Jainism as an etic one, that is a category, we are using to describe the normative applications currently taking place within the tradition, particularly in the diaspora, and often in direct engagement with scholars. It does not necessarily denote Jain social or political engagement, though it certainly could, but instead more broadly refers to the ways that Jains understand and make meaning of their obligations and activities, or lack thereof, within society, following their own cultural logics in particular times and places. I discuss this convergence through personal experience with the sanctuary, interviews, and reflections on how Love and Arms integrates the Jain Pandrapol tradition with animal advocacy as understood in the global Northwest. Shaleen and Shilpi Shah are a Gujarati Jain couple who never imagined founding an animal refuge that in under 9 years would save over 850 farmed animals from abuse, neglect, abandonment, and slaughter. It was July 2014 when the Shahs adopted their first animal, Hale, an Arabian mare, as a pet of sorts. Shaleen adored horses, having ridden them as a child in India, and envisioned riding Hale while also imparting the skill to his two young sons, Arav and Avi. In the process of learning novel writing techniques that demanded keen attentiveness to Hale's own will, Shaolin experienced, quote, a moment of inspiration. I could see that she is this incredible being, so in tune with her surroundings that she can connect at a profound level. How could I continue to bend her to my will for my desire to ride? She and all other living beings deserve to live their own lives on their own terms. Confronted with Hale's sophisticated individuality, the Shahs felt impelled to educate themselves on the harms, injuries, and fatalities pervading horse racing. This knowledge instigated a family pivot from animal use to rescue, yet still with a focus on horses. Coincidentally, Shilpi Shah had adopted a vegan diet a few years prior, eschewing dairy products shortly after the birth of their first son, Arav. Her decision stemmed from health concerns for herself and her child, as well as from newly acquired information about the harms intrinsic to the dairy industry. However, during that time, ahimsa for the Shahs manifested exclusively as a dietary restraint and had not yet motivated proactive measures to help living animals. Their second horse, Niblet, adopted in July 2015, would be the first animal saved under their new, albeit still emerging, value of ahimsa in action. Yet only 1 month later, the Shahs learned about a mare, later named Belle, who was being sold with her 2 babies at a slaughter auction not far from their home. They rushed out to save the entire family. While waiting for Belle and her children to be presented for sale, Shaolin witnessed for over 6 hours cows, sheep, goats, and pigs all being, quote, pulled, pushed, or kicked into the auction floor, sold by the pound. He and Shilpi soon realized that their plan to rescue horses, and only horses, no longer sufficed. Then that very night, the Shah's phone rang. By chance, 23 acres of land located only 2 miles from their home in Lafayette had suddenly become available. They were stunned, excited, nervous. They talked all night. Ultimately, they could not deny this, quote, clear sign from the universe that they needed to act. They signed the lease the following day. So allow me a little bit of an aside here. Note how the Shah's emerging intervention is responsive to what I may call a justice gap rather than a mere economy gap. I suggest that unlike the somewhat routine protocol of goshalas and panjrapols, which are mostly concerned with housing spent animals after a life of exploitation, the Shahs, in lockstep with the modern farmed animal sanctuary movement, were beginning to intervene in repudiation of animal farming itself. Thus, I argue, at Love and Arms, sanctuary should be understood in its full engaged political valence. To quote Ilan Abrel, while animal sanctuaries may be a relatively new form of animal advocacy, the idea of sanctuary as a form of political action or ethical practice goes back centuries. The etymological history of the word sanctuary can be traced to the Latin word sanctuarium, which means a place where sacred things are kept. Reflecting its more contemporary usage, sanctuary describes the practice of churches in England granting protection to fugitives fleeing arrest or violence from the 4th to early 17th century. I suggest that it would be a gross error to anthropolimit this meaning. Love and Arms, akin to other modern sanctuaries, quote, grants protection to those fleeing arrest, in a sense, and certainly violence. So now pivot with me for a second. It's the same month of Belle's rescue, August 2015, and I'm finishing the 2nd year of my master's degree in religious studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. On the 8th, I receive an email through a local group advertising a volunteer day happening that very day at a new animal sanctuary. The email asked volunteers to bring anything useful, anything with conceivable carrying, cleansing, constructive, or destructive utility. And this makes sense. The Shahs admit that they knew nothing about clearing land or building structures and were equally ignorant about caring for farmed animals. I mean, they had never even had a pet. I missed this volunteer day, which in retrospect was the pivotal moment for the eventual trajectory of the sanctuary. The Shah's initial vision was small in scale, but as Shaolin reminisced about the day that shook their world, the very first workday, that shifted completely. 30+ strangers show up to help us clean and fix and build that place. And then they kept coming. This experience, you know, reassured us like, okay, this is not just us. This is something. It is a community that really wants this. And in bringing a larger vision, we can really benefit animals in a much bigger way. The following spring, I joined the others on this rundown lot in Lafayette. I met Felix, his brother Franklin, and so many others, like Alfie, the goat from that title slide. The sanctuary was founded on ahimsa, non-harming, and karuna, compassion, yet the Shahs understood these values as universal and not Jainism specific. I was curious about this framing since I myself had not grown up with these explicit values, and certainly not with the notion of vows or vratas. Over Zoom in November 2023, I asked Charlene to fill in some gaps. Charlene was raised in Ahmedabad, Gujarat, until the age of 10, at which point his family moved to Jacksonville, Florida. He recounted the differences between the two sides of his family. His father's family from Ahmedabad are Theravasi Jains, or Murti Pujaka Jains, and his mother's family from Rajkot and Wankaneer in western Gujarat are Stanakvasi Jains. Charlene shared stories to contrast the formalism and ritualism of his father's family with the focus on, quote, philosophy and culture of his mother's. Even at a very young age, Charlene recalls having much more affection for the latter. As a sixth grade student at Ridgeview Elementary in Orange Park, Charlene was confronted with the myriad challenges of otherness, assimilation, and integration. He was the sole Indian and sole vegetarian at his school, encircled by a white American community that perceived Indians as backward and India the land of, as Charlene said, snake charmers, yogis, and fakirs. In the years that followed, owing to an inescapable pressure to fit in and a personal impulse towards self-exploration, Charlene investigated other philosophies and religions, from Buddhism to Wicca. He distanced himself from Jainism in any form of religiosity. Throughout high school and college, he identified as born Jain, but otherwise independently philosophical and spiritual. A quote, borderline atheist and borderline agnostic, Charlene practiced vegetarianism and believed in the values of nonviolence and compassion, but didn't tie these to Jainism. This general orientation continued for years, even at the time of the founding of the sanctuary. I wondered how much the global enculturation of Jains into the religion of nonviolence might generate the assumption of the timeless validity and universalist application of these values. But Charlene just also shared a pragmatic reason for the universalist messaging, the audience. Love in Arms is a sanctuary physically located in northern Colorado, operating digitally as an exclusively English language institution with mostly North American visitors. Charlene added how his upbringing in Florida directly influenced the messaging of the sanctuary. Going back to how I grew up in Florida, I recognize that I'm different. We're different skin, different culture, different perspective. And what I did not want to get in the way was that when people came for tours and were asking them to be inspired to compassion and giving up eating whatever they eat and choosing plant-based, choosing compassion, what I didn't want to be in that mix, very consciously, was the fact that we're not like them, Shilpi and I. Shilpi and Charlene made a conscious decision to minimize their literal visibility to reduce the likelihood that physical or digital guests would construe vegetarianism, veganism, or animal rescue as especially Jain or even Indian practices. And who could blame them, given the reflex disavowal of non-white and non-Christian lifeways in the United States, as well as the dogged conception of Indian religions as exotic and extreme. Charlene described how it was their first executive director, a non-Jain and non-Indian, who strongly suggested, after observing the Shah's interactions with the Jain community, that the Jain values of ahimsa, karuna, and jivdaya feature prominently in Love in Arms' mission statement, informational materials, and overall content. The Shahs consented. In addition, the targeting of the American Jain community for financial backing was absent during the early decision-making of Love in Arms. It was not until years later, partially owing to the encouragement of Charlene's father, that the Shahs embraced this affiliation. Charlene admitted that ever since making these changes, he, the skeptic, the one who only saw, quote, hypocrisy in religion, began to experience a, quote, new rediscovery of Jainism. So now pivot with me again to January 2024, when I'm reconnecting with Felix at the sanctuary. I'm asking staff and volunteers about how much they knew, if anything, about the Jain tradition and the ethic of ahimsa. Unsurprisingly, most knew almost nothing about Jainism prior to their involvement. Yet soon it became apparent that the Jain ahimsa comfortably cooperates with more ecumenical, if not also to say secular, understandings of nonviolence at the sanctuary. Jolene, the resident care director, captured the overall spirit, which I heard repeatedly. When Charlene came to speak to us about being Jain and coming from that, to me, I can't relate with a god or, organized religion in that way, because that's just not where I come from or what I believe. But I can definitely get behind compassion for all beings and nonviolence towards all beings. We're not like preaching a religion to people. It's really just nonviolence for all animals. And to me, I think that's something that's universal and people can get behind more like it's a religion. In my view, Love in Arms' inclusive tradition with innovation approach is visible in several ways, in ways that enfold the entire community. First, its relative lack of guidance from Indian Punjapols and its unmistakable alignment with what Donaldson and Kimlicka referred to as the key commitments of all modern farmed animal sanctuaries. These commitments far surpass the life support model applicable to many Punjapols and Goshalas. I lack the time to elaborate on these commitments, but in short, they are duty of care, a support for species typical flourishing, recognition of individuality, non-exploitation, non-perpetuation, and awareness and advocacy. Another novel way the sanctuary's diverse community manifests these commitments is through unanimous support for the vegan messaging of the sanctuary, coupled with the personal adoption of a vegan lifestyle. The acceptance and practice of veganism aligns with what the Shahs and other contemporary Jains regard as a significant ethical oversight in Jain lacto-vegetarianism, its neglect of the numerous injuries inflicted upon dairy animals, eventually culminating in their slaughter. While being vegan is not a strict requirement for staff members or volunteers, the practice is certainly encouraged. Another innovation is visible in the sanctuary's dedication to forever homing its residents, a pledge quite distinct from forever housing. And in that regard, I think of it much like the difference between homelessness and houselessness, as you see in human justice issues. All Love in Arms staff interpret active ahimsa as demanding not only saving animals from further experiences of human-inflicted harm, a shared value with the traditional Punjapol, but also developing a plan for fostering the thriving of the residents. This is described at Love in Arms as their enrichment focus. Charlene described the prospect of saving, feeding, and housing animals, but then doing little else. When we save them from one harm, but essentially then ignore their needs and treat them as caged lives, that in itself is himsa. Jolene echoed the same feeling. Sure, housing them and rescuing them initially is great, but it comes with so much more. Otherwise, it's basically just like sticking a human in a jail cell without anything to do. They get food and water, but they need more. What does this more involve? One example is providing all residents with proper medical attention, including routine checkups, preventative care, surgical interventions, alternative and non-invasive therapies, and, when necessary, arrangements for euthanasia. Residents' needs are also respected by gradually increasing the animal-centered design of the sanctuary. This approach involves rotating pens and pastures, carefully intermingling species to facilitate a greater diversity of animal-animal interactions and friendships, otherwise known as blending flocks, and introducing stimulating structures and toys appropriate to individual species, and especially individual personalities. If not the central component of the enrichment focus, one lauded by all staff and volunteers, is a practice called clicker play. The aim of clicker play is to use a physical tool to establish a, quote, shared language, a shared communication, that they, the animals, can then ask what they need, and we can ask them for things we need from them, end quote. Note the use of ask. Nearly all the animals at Love in Arms have experienced severe human-inflicted traumas, so performing acts in their best interests without accounting for their individual feelings of fear, stress, anger, and sadness falls short of ahimsa in action. Clicker play would be misunderstood as a tool to get animals to do things that are in their best interests. The heart of the practice is agential respect, to ask and be asked as much as possible. In short, it is ahimsa in the form of interspecies consensual relationality. So, to conclude, Love in Arms emerged, developed, and operates at an ever-evolving nexus of religious, cultural, historical, and regional sensibilities, including Jain ones. Its multifaceted intervention in the world requires neither the secularization of Jain values into universal values, nor a Jainization of the secular values of the modern farmed animal sanctuary movement. In general, engaged Jainism as a whole applies itself in dialogue with the people, institutions, and movements that share its core values, even if non-Jain, especially non-Jain. And perhaps Shailin Shah's new discovery of Jainism stems from a recognition that Jain thought and practice is alive and dynamic and porous, thereby open to ongoing reinterpretation and redefinition. While Love in Arms may not have been consciously founded on Jain values, its birth and life cannot be fully disentangled from Jain philosophy or history. But fortunately, there is no religious or secular mandate to harmonize all the elements operating at the sanctuary. In fact, their fluidity and complexity only add to their allure, to the enchantment of Love in Arms, or at least that's what I tell myself to justify another trip to see Felix. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Okay, so let's move straight on to our next speaker, Joey Tuminello. You have the floor.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Are you all able to see the full screen presentation?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, thanks so much for everybody for organizing, for participating, and for having me take part. I'm really excited in the conversation, very excited in talking a bit about Jonathan's presentation in relation to mine as well. And I appreciate the wonderful introduction. So in this presentation, I consider how a Jain philosophical perspective contributes to the discourse on meatless meat. Specifically, I focus on the relevance of Jainism's ontology of violence, or the different types of violence in Jain teachings. So on the Jain view in general, violence is not a strictly physical phenomenon. Rather, verbal violence, mental violence, violence in speech and thought can also be karmically binding, and people should do their best to avoid violence in all of its forms. Jain Dharma discourages violence in thought, not only because it may lead to physical violence, but also because such thoughts are violent in themselves. Foregoing meat by consuming an intentional likeness of animal flesh may generate many positive outcomes and is clearly superior to the support of industrial animal agriculture. However, this doesn't entail that it's permissible for moral agents to ignore the potential violence and thought associated with such consumption. Though not serving as an absolute argument against producing or consuming faux meat, I argue that Jainism's ontology of violence provides further support for taking faux meat's ethical concerns seriously. The degree to which meat substitutes bear a likeness to their counterparts has increased in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Over the last few years alone, companies such as Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods have created, refined, and mass-produced vegan hamburger patties that quote unquote bleed, using ingredients such as beet juice or leg hemoglobin derived from soy to try to replicate the aesthetic experience of consuming actual flesh. Reflecting on the Impossible Patty's likeness to meat, Oregon restaurateur Matt Adams claims that it's quote, it's actually confusing people. They'll send it back thinking it's meat, end quote. Burger King's chief marketing officer, Fernando Mercado, made a similar observation regarding the fast food chain's recent Impossible Whopper. People on my team who know the Whopper inside and out they try it and they struggle to differentiate which one is which. Rather than merely creating products that strongly resemble meat, entrepreneurs such as Ethan Brown of Beyond Meat are explicitly questioning ontological assumptions about what meat is. He says here, and this is from the volume, The Future of Meat Without Animals, that include a brief essay from him. Our obligation is to provide the consumer with a better meat, one that is freed from the animal and capable of delivering more of what consumers want: taste, protein, nutrients, convenience, with less of the downside. Just as few people, perhaps none, rail passionately for or against preserving the landline and embraced mobile phones, if we're successful, we'll see consumers in a relatively short period of time and with less controversy than one might expect welcome a better meat, one that is made from plants. So given the well-established negative impacts of industrial animal agriculture or factory farming on humans, animals, and the environment, this all seems to bode especially well. In a 2015 nationally representative survey in the United States, 2/3 of respondents reported reductions in meat intake over a three-year period, especially regarding red and processed meat. To some extent, these dietary changes map onto a growing concern regarding health impacts of meat eating, as evidenced by the World Health Organization's report showing positive associations between red meat consumption and colorectal cancer. A University of Michigan life cycle assessment comparing the production of a quarter-pound Beyond Burger patty with a conventionally produced beef patty of the same size found that, quote, the Beyond Burger generates 90% less greenhouse gas emissions, requires 46% less energy, has over 99% less impact on water scarcity, and 93% less impact on land use than a quarter pound of US beef. So by multiple metrics, it seems apparent that the production and consumption of the latest generation of plant-based faux meat is good, perhaps even morally obligatory for many people, given the current circumstances coupled with the public's desire for meat. While I'm not attempting to refute this view, I do want to call attention to possible ethical concerns regarding faux meat and the representation of animals as food. Though these concerns do not necessarily override the importance of producing and consuming faux meat, I argue that they should be taken seriously and that Jainism provides valuable insight as to why. There's a small but growing recognition of the symbolic qualities and possible ideological function of consuming meat. After outlining other arguments against this practice, journalist Maria Chiorando briefly remarks on a possible concern with endorsing the representation of animals as food. Quote, some have questioned whether buying these products perpetuates the idea that animals' bodies are food, hence our need to try and replicate them, end quote. In the article Beyond Viand, The Ethics of Faux Flesh, Fake Fur, and Thrift Shop Leather, Susan M. Turner applies utilitarian and deontological ethical theories to examine, among other questions, whether it's ethical to produce, sell, and eat faux meat. Because of utilitarianism's appeal to consequences to determine whether an action is right or wrong, as well as its emphasis on maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering for the greatest number of sentient beings, the ethics of faux meat's production, sale, and consumption, on that view, depends on the outcomes of engaging in these activities. So Turner observes that the relevant social scientific data was unavailable at the time of writing, but argues that a utilitarian should ideally find out the following information in rendering a moral assessment of this issue. Quote, we need to know if there is a tendency for vegetarians who eat faux meat to lapse as a result. Also, we would need to know if there is a greater chance a meat eater will consider becoming vegetarian when there are faux meat options available. If the overall result is more conversions back to meat than to vegetarianism, then faux meat will be morally problematic, according to a utilitarian like Peter Singer. If there's no difference or more vegetarian conversions, then faux meat might be off the utilitarian hook. So if the necessary data were available, these would be the variables to plug into a utilitarian calculation to determine the moral valence of the production, sale, and consumption of faux meat. This theory may provide a strong case against faux meat if it happens to lead to more overall suffering in comparison with other dietary choices, though Turner thinks the reverse of this is likely true. However, from a utilitarian perspective, intentions and motives have no direct bearing on whether an action is permissible, impermissible, obligatory, or above and beyond the call of duty. On this view, the representation of animals as mere resources within faux meat is not morally problematic in and of itself. On the other hand, Turner illustrates how a deontological ethical framework may lead to different conclusions. Recall that the philosopher Tom Regan modified Kantian ethics by replacing a being's rational capacity with the quality of being a subject of a life as the major criterion that determines moral worth. So on Regan's approach, any animal that's a subject of a life has some sort of intrinsic moral worth such that they should not be treated as if they exist as mere resources, instruments, or tools to be exploited for others' gain. Applying this deontological approach to her ethical examination of faux meat, Turner writes, quote, by producing and selling tofu, which has the taste, texture, and appearance of regular non-human animal meat, we're participating in the non-artistic representation of non-human animals as mere resources. Assuming vegetarianism is morally correct on deontological grounds, such acts must be morally wrong. While Turner notes that the ethics of eating faux meat is less straightforward than the ethics of producing and selling it from a deontological perspective, she ultimately argues that eating faux meat must be immoral because its consumption relies on the immoral practice of producing it, quote, even though the consumer may not be endorsing a representation of non-human animals as mere resources. In addition to its innovative application of normative ethical theories to some under-theorized practices, Turner's article illustrates the need to take seriously the ethical dimensions of faux meat, including those concerning the often overlooked act of representation itself. Rebecca Sinclair defends a perspective that resonates with Turner's exposition of deontological concerns, arguing that, quote, plant-based meats are never really free of the animal they intend to substitute, and they therefore reproduce certain frameworks of intelligibility that keep animals edible, even if they're not eaten, end quote. Sinclair applies Jacques Derrida's concept of the trace, the conceptual presence that is implied by an absence, to illustrate the ways that faux meat success is dependent on interpretations of animals as beings that it is okay to kill and eat. While not altogether dismissing the promise of faux meat in reducing animal slaughter, Sinclair importantly shows that focusing on this particular material consequence is not philosophically or ethically sufficient. Quote, we must also ask whether or not meatless meats will alter the intellectual, economic, and epistemological conditions that make slaughter and exclusion possible to begin with. Because the above conditions won't be satisfactorily altered through meatless meat, and because of the importance of recognizing animals as community members rather than as mere food or instruments for human satisfaction, Sinclair presents her case in hopes that we might eventually move beyond these attempts to reclaim the experience of animal flesh. So there's a small but growing amount of scholarship on ethical dimensions of faux meat. It's also received some attention in popular discourse. Here I provide an overview of the recognition of and advocacy against violence through thought within Jain teachings. This discussion illustrates the significance and nuance of Jain ethics, as well as the importance of Jainism in substantiating and augmenting debates on the symbolic representation of animal flesh through faux meat. Jainism entails the strongest and most thorough commitment to nonviolence of the major Indic philosophical and religious traditions. This is due in part to the Jain teaching that violence is not a strictly physical phenomenon. Characterizing this holistic understanding of violence, Ramakrishna Puligandla writes, quote, the practice of nonviolence in thought, word, and action is the cardinal virtue in Jain ethics. In this way, Jainism recognizes thought and its expression through language as possible avenues toward violence alongside physical action. This opposition to violence through thought and word goes beyond a strictly instrumental concern. From a more narrow consequentialist perspective, it would be reasonable to advocate against harmful thoughts only if there was good reason to believe that those thoughts tended to lead to physical violence. Acknowledging but also moving beyond this concern with the material impact of thought, Jainism's conception of violence entails that violence in word and thought can also be karmically binding. Subramanya Gopalan clarifies this key distinction. Quote, non-violence and non-killing are generally associated with acts, so that if the individual concerned does not indulge in the prohibited acts, he is absolved of the sins that might accrue to him. But though the act itself has to be avoided, the intention also must be pure. Since an act is always preceded by an intention and a will, mere avoidance of the act may not necessarily mean that there was no intention. So even when one avoids an act of physical violence, this avoidance does not automatically exempt that person from generating negative karma through thoughts or words. The categories of non-physical violence have a moral valence that overlaps with but is separable from violence in action. On the Jain view, concern for avoiding harm to others is bound up with avoiding harm to oneself by, for example, setting oneself on a path toward a rebirth that brings one further away from moksha. This principle applies to physical acts such as eating, but also applies to the accrual of negative karma through thought and word. As a result, the Jain commitment to vegetarianism simultaneously entails ethical concern regarding behaviors, objects, and events that incite violent thoughts, in addition to and apart from violent physical actions. This relationship between the Jain ontology of violence, karma, and consumption yields important insights into the ethical dimensions of pho meat's representation of animal flesh. Since Jainism's beginnings, it has shared fundamental tenets with Hinduism while also diverging in ways that shed light on a Jain perspective on pho meat. One such divergence is Jainism's recognition of the shared existential trajectory, as Anne Vallely describes it, of human and more than human animals as five-sensed beings. Beyond denouncing the physical actions of killing and eating animals, there are also some instances of Jain teachings warning against the symbolic representation of animals in food. This concern is illustrated in the Jain tale of King Yashodhara, spanning a conversation on the soul between a Jain ascetic and a guard. The ascetic recounts the karmic fate and painful deaths and rebirths of two nearby chickens. This rooster here is the reborn King Yashodhara, who in a previous life was the father of our King Yashomati. And this hen was in a previous existence Chandramati, the crude mother of the same King Yashodhara. Not being prepared to relinquish totally their customary dharma, they slaughtered a rooster made of flour as sacrifice to the goddess to whom they were devoted. Due to the maturation of that evil deed, they have become this pair of chickens whose minds are now at peace, being intent on listening to my discourse on the true religion. This story illustrates the connection between the Jain conception of rebirth and the construal of animal ethics beyond just physical actions alone. In the case of Yashodhara and Chandramati, substituting the killing of an animal with the sacrificial use of an animal likeness is laden with karmic implications. Though it's acknowledged that this is not morally identical to animal sacrifice, it's still recognized as part of a larger spectrum of violence, as well as potentially contributing to future physical violence. Even if there's not always a one-to-one correlation between a particular thought and a particular action, thoughts exist in a mutually influential feedback loop with physical actions, informing our interpretations of the world and ourselves. Elaborating on the Jain concern with self-harm and its relationship to harming others, P.K. Jain reflects on violence in thought and its application to the consumption of animal likenesses. Violence in thought is as detrimental to the development of character as violence in action. To this extent, candies and chocolates shaped as animals are generally not consumed in Jain families. Imagine a child going around eating the head of a rabbit or leg of a man. What will be his or her psychology and personality? If you want to eat chocolate, just do that. Why lace it with an unappetizing thought of cruelty to animals and/or cannibalism? P.K. Jain takes attitudes toward and interpretations of animals to be vital aspects of human character that people need to cultivate and develop in the right ways. If one continues to develop and embrace interpretations of animals as beings that it's okay to kill and eat, and to generally treat as only instrumentally valuable, this also might indicate a deficiency in one's character. This deficiency of character impacts oneself and others, as old habits can die hard, and it can be difficult to break free from deeply ingrained patterns in thought and behavior instilled over long periods of time. Though P.K. Jain does not directly address the development of faux meats that are intended to and sometimes do resemble animal flesh in a near indistinguishable fashion, his discussion indicates a broader application of the concept of violence in thought to a range of edible likenesses of animals, including but not limited to faux meat. On this note, while I hope to provide some clarification regarding a Jain perspective on faux meat, as well as the importance of engaging with this perspective in understanding and evaluating faux meat's ethical dimensions, I don't think that Jainism provides grounding for the total cessation of producing or consuming faux meat for the following reasons. First, a core component of Jain thought is the acknowledgement that life must feed on life to continue to exist. Thus, survival in all its forms necessarily entails some degree of violence. This emphasis then is on cultivating a lifestyle that minimizes harm as much as possible, generating positive karma rather than negative. While consuming faux meat may generate more negative karma than foods that are unaccompanied or less accompanied by violence and thought, it also is ethically superior to the consumption of foods that entail violence through thought as well as physical violence. Second, though Jains are not strict consequentialists, or perhaps more accurately, they're not reductive materialist consequentialists, given their defense of the moral impact of thought, their broader emphasis on ahimsa would still necessitate some concern for harm reduction. Even if Jains don't generally consume faux meat themselves or see such consumption as violent, it can also be plausibly interpreted as an imperfect and perhaps temporary solution with potentially great impacts. Third, though this may be far off given the ubiquity of meat consumption in so many places, a Jain perspective can also recognize that it's possible to experience faux meat with something in mind besides its resemblance to flesh. Further, those who have never consumed meat may even lack a proper frame of reference to elicit violence in thought through the consumption of it. It's debatable whether the replication of the aesthetic experience of flesh can ever be fully disentangled from the quote-unquote real thing or from the intentions embedded in the production process, but the possibility of some degree of disentanglement merits serious consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joey, for that. Okay, so this is the moment where everyone gets typing, and we want to see some questions appear in the Q&A box. While everyone's thinking and typing, I've got a small, maybe even just a question of clarification for you, Jonathan. In Love in Arms, what's the policy towards euthanasia when animals are really at the end and suffering?
They euthanize animals.
And then as a follow-up, I know that there's also Jain organizations organizing field trips there. Has there ever been kind of an overt discussion about whether or not that then fits into different aspects of Jainism? Because I know it's one of the big things that in India usually does not happen, and that people I talked to in the UK found issue with.
Yeah, this is like one of the, on the one hand, divergences, but also depending on who you're talking to, seems to be a kind of, I'd have to say, an improvement, right? This is one of the reasons why a lot of people don't like to. I'm saying improvement from the position of potential, say, donors to Jain Pandrapols and Goshalas who don't agree with the practice of this kind of karmic exhaustion, right? Non-intervention and suffering. So I don't know about the discussions there. I'm very interested, and actually I didn't include it today, but Love and Arms is starting to have in the summers what they're calling these kind of Jain retreats, where
Yeah, I just saw it on their website when
I hope to be
something
there.
about
I hope to be there actually this year for it, and I think that would be a great opportunity for me to get a little bit of data on how people feel about that. But it is a commitment, as far as I know, in all farmed animal sanctuaries in North America and elsewhere, that there is euthanasia practices because it is viewed as harm reduction.
All right. Thanks for that. For Joey, there's a question in the chat by Chris, but I actually wanted to ask something very similar. So in what you just presented, how does that relate to faux dairy, which is often sort of brought forth as a reliable alternative, also in Jain vegan websites, also in those campaigns? How about the ethics of that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful, very thoughtful question. I do think that the basic idea of violence through thought is potentially applicable. It's not necessarily something that I see as having to be restricted to issues of animal flesh particularly. You know, and actually there's an analogous trajectory that we've seen with dairy, which I hadn't really thought of until I was considering that question. But whenever you're looking at some of like the most cutting edge, or whenever I lived in Oregon, there was a cheese shop, a vegan cheese shop in Portland that I frequented, where they were doing like very particular kinds of cheese that you would not expect to see, you know, non-dairy versions of, and they were doing those vegan, really, you know, with the intent of, in those cases, like mimicking, right? So I think part of the potential ethical concern maybe has to do with that intention to mimic and to kind of engineer products in such a way that we wouldn't, you know, the ideal that some people are aiming for is that we wouldn't know the difference, right? And that's what we see with the, you know, the latest generation of faux meat. And we do see some trends in that direction within, especially like the upscale vegan dairy, or even the, you know, the use of dairy. So I do think that there are potential similar concerns there. Maybe that is, that I think, given, you know, the kind of the mixed perspectives that we see in the Jain community on veganism, even though a lot of the younger generations are trending towards it. Yeah, I mean, I think that is like that is a worthwhile topic to explore. And of course, like in my paper, there is an element of speculation, and I would love to, and I've talked with Chris about this before, augment this with some formal empirical research. I've seen a lot of this confirmed anecdotally by members of the Jain community, and my work with Jain communities, and when I was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in the US, and attending a London convention on Jainism some time ago. And then also, given your interest in Jainism online, you know, I didn't mention that I was looking at Quora just to see perspectives expressed there, and I saw similar things, like people pointing out ethical concerns with eating veg, thinking of non-veg while you're in that process. And I have a Jain cookbook that says something similar, like Jains may not consume like faux hot dogs and things like that, but they might be acceptable for other people as just part of the kind of written like essay parts of the cookbook, where they point that out subtly. So yeah, I do think, like, from a theoretical perspective, I see possible application there, but I haven't, like, you know, I'd like to develop a formal survey when it comes to, you know, the faux meat as well as non-dairy, whenever the attempt is to really mimic and be indistinguishable from animal products.
Thank you for that. I just sort of as a quick remark to that, and it's kind of maybe it's playing devil's advocate because I'm now taking something which is mostly from a non-Jain context, but which might be applicable at least to some people I spoke to in the UK. You could perhaps make the argument that it is a huge source of social non-violence making these things available, because in families where you have mixed dietary habits, people who need to sort of, you know, for business or for their social integration or for school, who need to be in canteens eating with other people and in restaurants, the fact that you can have a spaghetti and meatballs which is actually vegan, but then gives you the opportunity to eat, you know, to have that commensality, which is so important in human interaction, actually makes the world a lot more viable. Did you encounter a lot of these arguments? Are you planning to look into that further, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I've considered. Not that this might be the first time that someone has proposed it to me directly, and I think that that's definitely something worth taking into account. You want to consider the various impacts of that sort of decision, especially from an institutional perspective. Making those things available to people, I think, can do a lot of good. I think that also, in a way, kind of supports some of my observation at the end regarding the relative importance of harm reduction from a Jain perspective. But certainly having those available in a way that people are able to eat, and also not necessarily be called out for their dietary decisions. You know, on top of that, from the perspective of you know, vegan dairy products, you know, so many people around the world are also lactose intolerant, and many of those people are people of color and members of marginalized groups. And so I think there's actually an additional justice perspective in the availability of those. But you know, the particular concern that I was raising doesn't necessarily outweigh the general importance of vegan products being available. But I think it is a perspective that sometimes goes not really, you know, it's kind of under theorized, because people are, you know, in those areas are so excited about the availability of vegan products. We might not, or we might kind of gloss over the potential ethical concerns about the representation of animals or animal products.
Thanks. We've got two questions in the Q&A. The first one I think is mostly for Jonathan. Did you do any research on Panjrapols in India, Indian policies or international policies about this type of compassion?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned in the talk, this is something I think is actually necessary. When you read a lot of literature, we're kind of dealing with decades old accounting. And Yamini Narayanan's new book, Mother Cow, Mother India, talks mostly about Goshalas and doesn't do much of a historical, it's just kind of like an ancient nod, and then we get into the modern contemporary periods, but this kind of like medieval period is a bit dark. So I think that future work in this contrast between, say, the modern farmed animal sanctuary movement and what's happening in India with Panjrapols is ripe for further research. So I hope to be able to fill that gap.
All right, and the second question there is maybe just in general to whoever wants to answer first. And if you guys don't, then I will. Do diaspora Jains avoid having carnivorous pets like cats and dogs?
I feel like this is for both of us because we're dealing with rescue and carnivory at the same time. But Joey, if you want to start first, that works.
I'm not particularly aware, actually. That's something that I haven't looked into in detail, in the sense of, like, do Jains, for instance, avoid adopting cats? I'm not aware of that sort of avoidance, but that's something that I haven't gone out of my way to verify or ask about.
I will recommend, I remember years ago I haven't been there in forever, but there's a group called Vegan Cats on Facebook that I found to be probably the ripest philosophical location for discussion, because it was just really getting into these issues that I think Jains would actually be very concerned about, because it was about proximity, my proximity to violence, and then are cats actually carnivorous? What does carnivorous really mean, right? This is very similar to Joey's conversation. It's that there was always this notion of, say, cats as obligate carnivores. You see this all the time, obligate carnivores. But really, that doesn't have much validity. Cats, like any biological organisms, need nutrients. So if those nutrients can be provided in another product, plant-based or cultivated meat, then that's what they need. They're not obligate animal eaters, in other words. And this is kind of, I think, the question that comes up in a lot of the faux meat discussions, right? That we're making meat or we're making that. It's like, actually, we're making a substance that historically has been tied to animals. But yes, as Brienne's book announces or whatever, like the future of meat without animals. This is so relatively new, and I find it interesting in Joey's discussion too, because it's really so beyond like any thinking that Jain philosophers probably could have had, that we could possibly, and you see this in Manu, you see this in Hindu texts as well, like the possibility of procuring actual animal flesh without animals. I mean, you could get like roadkill, and the Buddhists were good about this too, an alms reception of already killed animals, but the thought of getting animal flesh without animals, I think, is just, it would be mind-blowing.
All right, I have a bit of an addition to the question of whether Jains in Diaspora are open to keeping dogs and cats, so traditionally considered obligate carnivores in the case of cats. In Belgium, most people who have cats, they are actually, they get to sort of roam free during the day, which is an important thing to tag, because I know that in other countries that might be different. So you can feed them. We have vegan cat food. We also have, for those who find that better, insect-based pet food, which is available. But when they go outside, well, our cats, I must assume, are not fully vegan. I do know of some people, some Jains in Antwerp, who have a cat that they feed kind of on an outpatient basis, so they don't necessarily consider it as their personal pet. But yeah, you know, cats, they tend to drift. So there's like a variety of practice, even though most Jains who own pets and who give them pet food with some modicum of animal product in it are kind of do consider it not ideal from a Jain philosophical perspective. But it reminded me, when I was interviewing this particular family, it reminded me of the Pajrapols in India who take care of birds of prey on an outpatient basis, which from a Jain philosophical perspective is again debatable, because essentially you know what they're going to do when they go out, right? But there is a form of care and about a form of true care and investment there, even on an outpatient basis, both for the birds of prey in India and for the cat in Antwerp. So it's a spectrum. Okay, we have, let me see, we have quite a long text in the Q&A, so thank you all very much for the presentations. A comment and a question for Jonathan. First, as someone who has visited multiple sanctuaries for farmed animals, Loving Arms is unique in how deeply their practice of ahimsa and aparigraha permeate the daily work of staff and volunteers. So here comes a question. Do you think that Loving Arms serves as a model for Jain Pajrapols to pursue both in India and diaspora? And are they representing a modern, dare I say, evolved iteration of Jain teachings, knowing what we know now about animal suffering, or representing what the Jain text originally meant by non-harming? Go for it.
This reminds me a bit of Tine, the slide you shared, where it was about how traditionally older generations are funding temples and goshalas and tagging things for jivdaya. I also could tell a bit about how, at least I've heard, how donations to Loving Arms are specifically and oftenly tagged as jivdaya, like they want to be in that tradition that from older generations. But you said that there's younger generations who don't like that, or like a little upset with that, or upset with how traditional Pindrapals are run. And I think this is similar to what's happening at Love and Arms. In my presentation, I tried to show how, Shailene, as brought up in the United States, growing up in a very specific culture and environment, actually shares, I think, some of the frustrations that next gen Jains are also expressing, which is some of these older not only practices, but perhaps also what's the word, negligence of the issues that we've already brought up. Joey brought up about, say, lactose normalcy, lactose intolerance, ways of things of financial inequalities, racial inequalities, all these other issues I think are becoming relevant systemic issues. Animal farming as an actual enterprise. And so what Diana asks here, and are they representing a modern and, dare I say, evolved? I'd like to say innovative in this sense. I'd rather be a little less kind of moralizing. I'd like to say at least innovative here in the sense that they're concerned with justice interventions. And I could give a lot more examples of Love and Arms. It's a lot of justice interventions and not what folks might refer to as retirement plans for these animals, right? Once they've been exploited, what do we do with them now? Let's let them live out this pretty much life where we're doing like a life support system and actually not providing end-of-life care, or at least in the realm of euthanasia. So it's definitely modern, and it's definitely concerned with larger operations outside of, say, just a concern for ahimsa, two, the karmic exhaustion of that animal, and three, the proximity that one has to intervening with these animals. I think Love and Arms and the modern farmed animal sanctuary movement as a movement is trying to intervene more systemically, more structurally. And I could go on and on about examples that I see from other sanctuaries, but I think it'd be fair to say that.
Right, thank you very much. There might be another question which is interesting. Then again, we move to Joey about the use of the term edible. Is it a gastro-scientific term or a moral term, or both? It seems interesting to sort of interrogate that, to connect to the necessary harms and what makes animals edible and what makes them food.
Right. Yeah, good question. And the concept of edibility is just generally fascinating to me. I actually did my dissertation on the relationship between the categories of food and drugs, and was looking at that, the sort of spectrum-based approaches that we see in more like Ayurvedic medicine versus perspectives that see them in a dichotomous way, or kind of contrasting between food and drugs on different as different categories. So I'm thinking about that similarly when we're saying that something is edible. In the quote that I provided during my talk from Rebecca Sinclair, I think that she's getting at something like socially acceptable as okay to eat. And
which is close to the Jain terms that are used, bhakshya and abhakshya, actually sort of translate to edible, right. But it's that interpretation of edible. Huh?
That's right. Yeah. And we see within the Jain philosophy of food broadly, when you're looking at the abhakshya foods, there's so much beyond simply, conventional Western understandings of sentience. And you're talking about, the consumption or non-consumption of root vegetables and things of that nature. Yeah, of course, when we're talking about edible in maybe the most basic, I guess, like in terms of what is biologically capable of being consumed, that applies so broadly when you think about it. We're thinking about like disorders like pica, where people crave clay or dirt or things of that nature. Like we can get very broad about what is technically edible. And whether that means that it has to be tied to lethality or non-nutritive value to be inedible, or what that really means. Yeah. So I do think, I see it used in both ways. So I do think that it's interesting to clarify that often when we're talking about this context, we're talking about that sort of shared social imagination of like what is acceptable when we talk about edibility.
Yeah, it seems, just to add to that, seems like because then the immediate pivot is to like the cannibalism taboo. This is like really where we're pivoting. We have to stop seeing like things as edible because it's like a theater of cannibalism. But that actually, I think the concern is about the killing. Like from the Jain perspective, I always thought it's like, is the concern the consumption or is the concern the killing? Right, and this is the hardest. This is why I think also like the Buddhists and the Tikot Parishuddha, right, the threefold purity of Buddhism is extremely influential here and pertinent.
What I was thinking to add is this shared imagination of what is socially acceptable to eat. I think, I mean, and I might be sort of, stating the obvious, but that's kind of that's a relative issue, isn't it? In Belgium, traditionally, horse meat is food. In a lot of places around the world, that is, oh my God, no. You get really strange reactions to that. So, what is generally accepted and to what extent does it make sense in today's day and age to use this Northwestern global perception of what is considered edible? So this is not really a question, this is a thought from Tine. So I'm gonna have a look whether there is any last things in the Q&A we need to address, but I don't think there is, which is all well and good because we have about 1 minute of time left on this session. So from my part, I want to thank everyone who is present, who asked questions, who listened in, especially the presenters for making this a really interesting dialogue. I think we all have a lot of thinking to do after this. And then I think I'm going to hand it over, and I don't know if I'm handing it over to Marie-Hélène or Chris for a final goodbye and maybe sort of a pin in the next session.
Yes, thank you. As Tina said, thank you very much to all of you for an amazing session, a lot to think about indeed. I'm just letting you know that next time we meet for our very last session of the season, and there we will have John Court to moderate the discussions between 4 PhD candidates in Jain Studies who are already doing a fantastic work. So do register to this event. As always, just click on the Future Events tab on the main website, as you can see here online, and that will bring you to our agenda where you can click on the Register Now button. So we are very much looking forward to it. See you, and it will be on May 19th. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you very soon. Thank you.
Jai Jinendra.
Jai Jinendra.